Hello, 5th grade. This is our video answering questions from Chapter 8 of Book 2, Chapter Lancelot and Elaine, which have a few pretty tragic and sad stories. Our chapter opens up with kind of a happy point where it talks about the fact that King Arthur and his knights are doing a nice job of suppressing the Saxons, and peace is becoming more common. But the first question talks about the dark side to that. So how does the evil concerning Lancelot and Guinevere creep in? Well, there's not too much for knights to do anymore, and so Lancelot's got some free time, and so do other knights. So they're still training, but there's not as many adventures to go on. And so with all that extra time, Lancelot continues to serve Guinevere as a knight, but there's not as many knightly things to do. And so now they're spending time together, not as a knight for his king's wife, but instead as friends. And they start to spend more and more time together, and Arthur stops knowing about it. And that's where we start to see the problem, because when you're married to somebody, you have a unique relationship with them, and that's the person that you get to know the best. So if the person that you're married to is spending more and more time with someone and you don't know about that, that's a potential problem to cause, or room to cause a problem. And that's what's happening with Lancelot and Guinevere, because there's all this free time, they're spending it together, and they start to fall in love with each other, even though she's already married. And so we see Lancelot has these feelings for Guinevere that he can't suppress, but he's also got a lot of guilt because it's something that he can't ever act on. He can't marry Guinevere because she's already married, and she knows that too. And so Lancelot's very torn apart, being called the best knight, but not feeling all that great. So then the chapter continues, and he gets to go on some adventures, and he comes to the Castle Carbonek. If you remember, that's the one that Percival found the Holy Grail in. And who is there but King Pelles, who we'd not read about for a long time. And who's King Pelles' ancestor? Well, that's question 2. Look up Joseph of Arimathea in the Bible. Joseph of Arimathea, we don't know too much about him, but he was a wealthy man that after Jesus passed away, Joseph donated his tomb so that Jesus would be able to be buried there. And if you remember from earlier in the years, we talked about the catacombs and that Christians would be buried there. It was very expensive to bury someone, and especially to have a tomb to put them in, which is why many people would be cremated, or their body would be turned into ashes. But Christians wanted to preserve the body, and so Joseph of Arimathea donated his family tomb so that Jesus could be buried there. And Joseph's descendants, you can track the line down, or in the story you can, and eventually we come to King Pelles, which is why he is the king of Castle Carbonek, which is where the Holy Grail is. So that's his connection to the Grail and to Jesus through Joseph of Arimathea. King Pelles has a daughter, Elaine, and that goes to question 3. She sees Lancelot and falls in love with him, and he is responsible to her and spends time with her and is very polite. But as we mentioned, he only has love for Guinevere. And he's sad about that because it's nothing he can ever do because she's already married, but he can't feel love for anyone else because he only loves Guinevere. And so Elaine asks her father, what can I do? And he says, don't worry, you'll be married eventually, because he's able to see the future a little bit. And so she goes, not wanting to wait, and invests in some dark magic along the lines of Queen Morgana Le Fay. And so Morgana Le Fay, and or rather her magic, is able to change Elaine to look like Guinevere. And then she sends a message to Lancelot, pretending to be Guinevere, and says, come visit me. Lancelot gets there and they're alone, and he can't help himself. He says, I want to marry you, and we're alone. And so Guinevere, who's actually Elaine, says, yes, that's great. They get married. But Lancelot wakes up the next day, and the charm is gone, and he sees that it's actually Elaine. She apologizes, but now we're on the next question. What happens to Lancelot? Because he is shamed, he wakes up and he feels enormous guilt. He's acted on what he shouldn't, even though it wasn't Guinevere, knowing that that's what he wants to do. He is so torn up that he jumps out the window and runs away. He doesn't take his sword, he doesn't even get dressed, but he, for a long time, lives as a hermit. And he, it says on page 258, his wits quite gone from him, so he goes insane living in the wilderness. All the knights go and look for him, and eventually they are able to find him. Let's look at question 5. Why can Lancelot not touch the Grail, even though in earthly matters he is the best knight? He may be the strongest, he may be the bravest, he may even appear respectful of others. But it actually goes back to the last chapter when Percival was learning about a knight from Lancelot. And Lancelot said it's not the deeds that make a good knight, it's the heart behind that knight. So even though Lancelot's the one that gave that speech to Percival, we see that it's Lancelot. He is the knight that even though he does great deeds and is considered the best knight, he has a heart behind all of that that is conflicted, that he's giving in to sin, and has a relationship with Queen Guinevere that he is not supposed to have. And so even though all the other damsels really love Lancelot, Lancelot loves Guinevere. Those are all the questions, but it's also worth, on page 261, this can be a little bit confusing, there's a story about another Elaine, another girl that falls in love with Lancelot, and she ends up dying because she is so sad that she cannot be with Lancelot. The original Elaine, the one who married Lancelot, it says we don't know what happened to her, that she disappeared, and that even after she left the Castle Carbonek, which is where King Pelles and the Grail are, she was unable to return or to find that castle. It's hidden from those who are not able to be there or are not supposed to yet. The other important thing to note from this is the name of the son of Elaine and Lancelot, and that's Galahad, a name that you've heard before probably and will definitely hear more from again. After Lancelot wakes up and returns to Arthur after he was insane, Galahad goes and grows up with some monks and other holy people and will eventually become a knight that's very important for us to follow. And there was a prediction or two about him. I wonder how many of you remember that. All right, if you have more questions, I'm happy to discuss them during our Zoom session, or feel free to email or call me. You can also look on the resources tab of the homeroom, and you'll see our complete review guide for your test, which is on Friday of this week. Thank you, 5th grade, and I'll see you soon.